why East Europeans are saying build that wall, and maybe you should take that beach vacation in Libya off your bucket list for the time being. We'll talk about all that and more on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, happy Monday to you. I'm Chuck Holton, and welcome to all our new viewers and listeners on iTunes and elsewhere. If you were planning on a beach vacation in Tripoli, you might want to put that off this year as armed confrontations resumed in Libya between the UN-backed Government of National Accord, that's the GNA, and General Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army, or LNA, in the southern neighborhoods of the country's capital last Thursday. Explosions were heard throughout the capital city as firefights destroyed an LNA tank and GNA forces fought off the attempt to take the city. This has been going on for some time. Forces led by General Haftar have been trying to gain control in Tripoli since April, but faced resistance from UN-backed forces, that's the GNA. So far, fighting has left at least 650 people dead and displaced hundreds and thousands of people, according to the United Nations. So maybe it wasn't such a good idea, after all, for the Obama administration to topple Gaddafi and then just leave the country all alone to let every jihadi around raid that country's stores of military hardware. I mean, unless you were trying to create a country that looks like a cross between Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. All right, let's move on. Immigration seems to be high on everybody's minds these days. In Eastern Europe, there's a humanitarian crisis underway that's very similar to what we're seeing on the U.S. southern border. And I've been talking about that for some time. Aid groups are warning of a developing humanitarian crisis in Bosnia as thousands of migrants make their way to one of the poorest countries in that whole region. And it's pretty volatile, too, where locals have already have a hard time keeping their kids fed. Here, the head of the Red Cross in Bihać, Serbia, says they're struggling to provide migrants with food and sanitary products. He says, in migrant reception centers, we can accommodate around 3,500 migrants. Right now, we have over 10,000 migrants in Krajina alone, and the majority of them have nowhere to sleep. We have no beds for them. It adds to our problems and results in frequent clashes between migrants and disturbs the public peace and order. So these migrants tried to move further north into Croatia, as they normally did, but they were turned away, and now they're kind of stuck in Bosnia, sleeping on the streets. That's causing a lot of tensions among the migrants themselves, who are fighting amongst each other, and with local residents there in Bosnia. This resident said, quote, "They run around freely. We can't sleep peacefully anymore. We're constantly on alert. You see them running up the hill with sticks, and they fight there, and they're breaking into my garage. What I can tell you, we call the authorities, but they're not doing anything." The local authorities recently considered imposing a curfew on the migrants, but then put that idea on hold. The so-called Balkan route that migrants from the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa take, hoping to reach Western Europe, has shifted south now to Bosnia about 2 years ago, after governments closed off the other kind of more established paths going into Western Europe. Most migrants arrive in Bosnia from Greece after moving relatively unimpeded across Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. Most of the migrants come from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. All garden spots, to be sure. Bosnia is a lot like Panama. It's a small, poor country that's struggling to house, feed, and provide psychological care for 30,000 migrants or more. At the same time, the migration pressure continues to grow. In the first 5 months of this year, Serbia registered over 9,000 new migrant arrivals, which is 12 times more than for the entire year of 2017. Meanwhile, Bosnian President Milorad Dodik has blocked UN aid agencies from going to help the migrants, claiming, and probably correctly, that it'll only encourage more illegal migration. Now, normally these travelers would continue on into Croatia, but that country's putting a stop to that by, you guessed it, building a border barrier. And what do you know? It's working. On Tuesday, crews working for the Croatian government erected a spiked fence at a border crossing where police clashed last year with a large group of migrants trying to enter from northwestern Bosnia. The Croatian Interior Minister, his name is Davor Bozinovic, I think, says it was the EU's idea that they put up that fence. Meanwhile, Bosnian human rights organizations are so far beyond overwhelmed, it's not even funny. They're trying to help the thousands of migrants that are sleeping on the streets with no organized food deliveries or medical assistance. So several prominent human rights organizations have accused Croatian police of brutally beating migrants, confiscating their belongings, illegally pushing them back into Bosnia without notifying Bosnian border guards, and some of the migrants say the same thing. But while Croatian government and its law enforcement agencies are pretty unapologetic about protecting their borders, they reject the notion that they've abused the migrants in any way. So Katarina Zoric is a Croatian Red Cross representative, and she says, quote, "We can no longer describe the situation as a migration crisis, as it has effectively transformed into an all-encompassing humanitarian crisis that creates numerous problems for the local population." Well, she could be just as easily talking about New Mexico or Texas. On Friday, CNN reported that ICE has over 5,200 migrants in quarantine for exposure to measles or chickenpox. U.S. refugee centers are so overwhelmed down on the southern border that the Border Patrol is releasing over 1,000 illegals every day into our country, and most of them never show up again for a court date or asylum hearing. The global mass migration from north to south, or from south to north rather, is one of the defining crises of our time. But why exactly? Studies show that we're living in one of the most peaceful eras in all of human existence. More than 4 billion people now live in democracies. That's more than ever, over half of the planet. And that's the highest level in history. Wartime deaths might have ticked up over the last 5 years or so because of Syria, but they're still at historic lows. So why now? Why are so many people leaving everything and making perilous journeys of thousands of miles to go to a country where they don't know the language or the culture or anything, and which likely has a long, cold winter, the likes of which these migrants have never experienced in the more equatorial countries they come from? Well, here's my theory. I blame Apple. Since 2007, when the computer giant released the world's first smartphone, we've now arrived in a world where nearly 40% of the global population, that's almost 4 billion people, own one of these devices. It gives internet access to literally billions of people who don't own a computer and never have. Now these devices are enriching our lives in many ways, but we can keep in touch with loved ones, we can navigate easily, we can visit places around the world virtually. And pictures. Did you know there are more photos taken every day than there were taken in the first 100 years after the invention of the camera? And that's all because of smartphones. All those pictures, though, give people an easy way to see what the rest of the world looks like. I remember one time traveling to the Iran-Iraq border. It's one of the bleakest places I've ever been, just flat desert as far as you can see in every direction. No trees, no grass, no rivers, lakes, just dirt. And yet somehow there were people, Bedouins living out there, even though I have no idea what they ate. And I remember thinking, these people don't have TV. They've never been anywhere else. They've never seen a tree. They literally must believe that the rest of the planet looks just like this. And, you know, if you knocked them unconscious and put them on a plane to West Virginia, they'd wake up and without a doubt be convinced they had gone to a different planet, to heaven. I guess that probably means if you knocked them on the head and they woke up in New York City, they'd think they'd arrived in hell. But anyway, my point is this. Nowadays, the lowliest sheep herder in Afghanistan has a mobile phone. Even Cuba has internet now. And all these people can suddenly see what the rest of the world looks like and realize that there are better places to live than the whole of a country that they happen to hail from. And so many of them just decide to pack up and head for greener pastures. And you can't really blame them. Now, I remember an article I read in 2001 called The Death of Distance, How the Communications Revolution is Changing Our Lives. I found that article and linked to it in the end notes of the show if you want to go read it for yourself. Anyway, I just remember the article talking about how within a few years, almost every person on the planet would have a device in their pocket that would allow them to connect with every other person on the planet. And if you're too young to remember the world before the internet, it's probably hard for you to understand what a crazy statement that was at the time. Well, that time has come, and it's changing our lives in very profound ways. One of them is making people want more and better in ways they never dreamed of before. I mean, imagine this. You live in a remote village in the mountains of Guatemala or Nicaragua or somewhere. You got a year-round growing season, so you grow or raise just about everything you need. You have no taxes to pay. You have no bills. You eat mostly fresh organic produce. You have strong familial and societal bonds, deep cultural traditions that you grew up with, and a halfway safe, tranquil environment. Are you poor just because you don't have any money? Or are you rich because you really don't need any? To answer that question, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. So I wanted to bring you out here to show you something that I've been talking about for a while, and that is just exactly why we don't necessarily need to bring people to the United States to make their lives better. I want to introduce you to my friend, Sebastian. So, this is how my friend Sebastian gets to work every day. His house is just behind me up the hill there, and his farm is down here in this lowland. And you can see his grandson, Jorge, here is taking his daily bath. That's how they get clean. This is the place where they bathe, and it's a beautiful, clean mountain stream. Might be a little chilly, but we are in the tropics. Trabajando.
¿Cómo le va?
Muy bien, muy bien. Dios les bendiga. So this is my friend Sebastian. ¿Cuántos años tienes tú?
Yo soy 68.
68 years old.
Me falta un mes y unos días para cumplir los 68.
So he's going to be 68 in 1 month, he says. We're just getting into springtime here, and so Sebastian's been cleaning up the farm down here where it's gotten overgrown during the rainy season.
El bajo que se va así para allá.
Ajá.
Para allá.
¿Y vas a limpiarlo todo?
Sí, para allá.
Hasta allá.
Sí.
So he's been farming this plot of land for his entire life. And that's what he does. That's his living here. He doesn't make a lot of money. He doesn't need a lot of money. And this is kind of what I was getting at, is that when we're talking about poverty, most people would look at Sebastian and they would say that he's a very poor man because he doesn't have any money. But at the same time, I tell him he's the wealthiest man in our town because he doesn't need money. These are mandarin oranges. Do you know how expensive these things are in the States? And Sebastian has dozens of mandarin orange trees on this property, not to mention banana and grapefruit and avocado and beans and yucca and plantain and all sorts of other food items that he grows himself. And so, I mean, think about that. Think about the concept of poverty when you live in a place where you have everything you need that grows all year round. You can care for yourself off of your own piece of land. You don't need much. Sebastian has not had electricity his entire life until about a year ago. This just goes to show, I think, that what we consider to be poverty very often is just a different way of life and can actually be wealth. See, I think a lot of the people who are coming north out of these Golden Triangle countries in Latin America are being lied to. They're being told that they have a better way of life waiting for them across the border in the United States, when in reality, they live in a pretty nice place as it is. And yeah, they might not have a lot of money, but they don't need a lot of money. They need less money than you do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So they might be poor, and they may come from a country where drug violence is common, but the entire population of the developing world doesn't necessarily need to come to America to better their lives. Here's what I think we ought to do. We need to work on ways to allow these ubiquitous smartphones to do more at keeping people where they are, where they were born, and improve their lives right there, rather than convincing them they need to jump the fence to someplace the grass appears to be greener. That's all I have for today, folks, and thanks for liking and sharing with your friends. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and I welcome your feedback. I'd like to hear from you. See you back here tomorrow, where we don't just report the news, but we help you make the news a little bit better. Have a great week.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.